The Subcommittee on Federal Lands will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Subcommittee is meeting today to consider HR 1820, sponsored by Representative Siscomani, the Federal Lands Amplified Security for the Homeland Act, or the FLASH Act. This bill represents comprehensive solutions to secure our federal borderlands and protect them from environmental damage. I ask unanimous consent that the following members be allowed to participate in today's hearing from the dais. The gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman, and the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Siscomani. Without objection, so ordered. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted in accordance with Committee Rule 3, Parent O. Without objection, so ordered. I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. Morning, sir. First of all, I want to begin by commending Representative Siscomani for both the timeliness and the importance of the legislation he has brought before us today. As has been widely reported, the Biden-Harris administration has compiled the most incompetent and disgraceful record imaginable when it comes to the protection of our southern border. Although President Biden is no longer in office, the country is still reeling from his damaging and disgraceful open border policies. Under the former president's watch, immigration authorities recorded more than 8.7 million encounters with illegal immigrants crossing into the United States from Mexico. This unprecedented surge overwhelmed America's response capabilities and created a confluence of security, environmental, and humanitarian crises. Thankfully, President Trump is taking strong and decisive action to end this crisis. But Congress must also do its part. We must create robust safeguards to ensure that this kind of reckless damage can never again be inflicted by an irresponsible president. Recognizing this duty, my colleague from Arizona, Representative Siscomani, has presented the thoughtful legislative package before us today. His bill empowers Border Patrol and local law enforcement to protect those areas that were left especially exposed and vulnerable by the Biden administration, our southern federal border lands. Approximately 35% of the southern border is federally owned, so the conditions that prevail in those areas have a significant influence on overall border security. And the large-scale illegal migration that has occurred in those regions has also destroyed fragile ecosystems. The facts are unambiguous. State governments, and we must rely on state estimates since federal agencies refuse to gather meaningful data, have calculated that each illegal migrant leaves behind an estimated 6 to 8 pounds of trash during their journey across the border. With more than 2.1 million encounters with illegal entrants last year, it's likely that illegal immigrants left a minimum of 12 million pounds of trash in 2024 alone. Worse still, this environmental degradation is happening in our most sensitive landscapes, national parks, national monuments, and wilderness areas. Last February, I witnessed some of this ecological devastation firsthand. When this subcommittee held a field oversight hearing on the border in Sierra Vista, Arizona, I visited the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge and the Coronado National Forest. While there, I was dismayed to see trash-strewn landscapes, illegal campfires, and decaying food piles. If we truly care about conserving our federal lands and leaving them in better state for future generations, we cannot ignore this crisis. And by the way, you can see a picture of that right behind me here. It is with this realization that prompted me to sponsor the Trashed Border Act last Congress. That bill requires federal land managers to develop policies and protocols for addressing the massive trash accumulations that have piled up along the southern border. It also requires those agencies to provide current data on the amount of waste collected on federal lands along the southern border. Finally, that legislation would increase penalties and fines for illegal immigrants who desecrate our public lands. Key provisions of that bill are incorporated in today's legislative package. The border crisis' impact on public lands was not limited solely to environmental damage. Under the Biden administration, federal borderlands became increasingly dangerous. Even in strong enforcement years, federal borderlands are often targeted by criminals, drug smugglers, and human traffickers because they are remote, largely uninhabited, and less frequently patrolled. Under President Biden's shameful neglect, certain sectors resembled all-out war zones. Federal borderlands have also become a haven for organized crime. Drug smugglers and human traffickers have directed illegal border crossers towards sparsely populated portions of the border to enter the U.S. with a lower chance of detection. Border Patrol agents have reported being fired upon in rugged terrain when attempting to arrest suspected illegal migrants. Given the unprecedented numbers of known gang members and suspected terrorists who have crossed the border, this mismanagement has made America's public lands alarmingly unsafe. The issue is even more pronounced in wilderness areas, which comprise over 1 million acres along the southern border. In these areas, federal land managers impose severe limitations on Border Patrol's accessibility. For example, since mechanized and motorized vehicles are prohibited within wilderness areas, Border Patrol agents must rely on horses to pursue fleeing suspects in cars or off-highway vehicles. These nonsensical restrictions hamper operational effectiveness and needlessly jeopardize officer safety. Despite their dismal track record, I still hope that my Democrat colleagues will join us in protecting our federal borderlands and the safety of all who find themselves there. Everything in today's featured legislation deserves strong bipartisan support. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to the insights that each of you will bring to this important discussion. With that, I will now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to read just 2 brief excerpts from 2 different articles in the last 2 weeks. One is from the Star Tribune. Superior National Forest staff deficit worsens. An agency employee in Minnesota who requested an anonymity out of fear of retribution said the cuts and fallout have SNF, Superior National Forest staff, in crisis mode. Other forest colleagues are worried that they'll lose their jobs, and some career employees feel pressure to resign or risk losing benefits, the worker added. We were already hanging on by a thread, the person added. Now, Musk, Trump, and Doge are thinning us even further. This is huge for the boundary waters, recreation, and timber and fire management. It's another article. Headline: There is literally no one. The fallout coming to Lake Tahoe after Forest Service gutted. This is from the San Francisco Gate newspaper. Mr. Chairman, across the country, Forest Service employees, Department of Interior employees, civil servants at the Bureau of Land Management are losing their jobs. They're being purged from the federal government. In many of your districts, as is the case in mine, timber management, wildfire management, wildfire mitigation, watershed protection, all of it put at risk. And while I have great respect for my colleague from Arizona, and we work closely together on a number of different matters, I have to be candid that I am disappointed that this subcommittee has not even entertained the idea of convening on any of the matters that I just described. I understand this is a priority for my Republican colleagues. I understand this bill that you've proposed that directs, I guess, and my sense is, it essentially tells the Forest Service and the Department of Interior that they can't impede any efforts of DHS. Of course, it seems like that could be achieved by a phone call, right? I mean, you could call Secretary Burgum at the Department of Interior and say to him, hey, you know, it'd be helpful if you didn't impede any of the efforts of Secretary Noem at the Department of Homeland Security. I'm not really understanding why it requires a federal law and the expenditure of our time here today when in every single one of your districts, Forest Service employees are being fired as we speak. It does not make sense to me. The priorities of this committee, as is the case with the priorities of the majority, are out of step with the facts on the ground. And, Chairman, you know me to not be, I think at least, a particularly partisan person. We have run this, we've worked together for years on this particular subcommittee, considering bipartisan legislation. It's the most productive subcommittee, at least it was, in the United States Congress. Hundreds of bills by members on both sides of the aisle that are largely supported on a unanimous basis. So it pains me to lay bare my fears in this regard, but I have to do that because when I go back home to my district at the end of the week, I can promise you they're not going to ask me about this bill. What they are going to ask me about are the wildfire mitigation projects in the national forests that I have the privilege of representing that are now in jeopardy because the Trump administration has decided to gut the federal workforce. And they will ask why, as the ranking member of the Federal Lands Subcommittee, we haven't taken that up. And I will tell them, well, it's because this week Republicans decided that rather than telling Secretary Burgum to work with the Department of Homeland Security, they'd pass a federal law to force him to do it. That's your prerogative. You choose the agenda here. But make no mistake, I don't think the American people are going to be supportive. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you to the ranking member, and I do truly enjoy working with you here and look forward to continuing to do that. I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Westerman, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Tiffany, for holding this hearing today. I also want to thank Representative Siscomani for compiling this crucial legislation. The committee traveled to Representative Siscomani's district last year to see firsthand the environmental destruction happening on southern federal borderlands. We went to the border with Cochise County Sheriff Mark Daniels. Sheriff Daniels told us something I'd like everyone to remember as we listen to today's hearing. We do not have a border security problem in this country. We have an organized crime problem, is what the sheriff told us at that field hearing. Nowhere is this issue more pronounced than on federal lands. People often don't realize just how much of our southern border is comprised of federal land. In Arizona, for example, 80% of the border is federally owned. On this committee, we have often highlighted the serious problems that result from excessive federal land ownership. But these issues take on an even greater significance along the southern border, where America's safety and sovereignty are on the line. Whenever I meet with CBP officials, they reiterate how difficult it is to patrol the federal portions of the border. These agents, who are just trying to do their jobs, frequently lack accessible roads to conduct effective patrols and must contend with the head-scratching absence of physical barriers that are proven to reduce illegal immigration. In some areas, restrictive land use designations, such as wilderness areas, mean agents must stop active pursuit of dangerous criminals because they can't use mechanized or motorized equipment. Instead, they have to wait for horses to arrive while dangerous illegal immigrants get further and further away. This just isn't common sense. These restrictions come with considerable cost. When we fail to secure our federal lands, we fail to secure our border. This lesson was revealed in painful clarity during the recent chaos of the Biden administration when more than 8 million illegal entry attempts occurred along the southern border. This surge in illegal crossings pushed law enforcement to the brink and imperiled the well-being of large swaths of our public lands. Drug and human traffickers seek out remote areas to access the country and evade detection. Illegal immigrants cut trails through sensitive wildlife habitat, start wildfires, and leave behind an estimated 6 to 8 pounds of trash per person. Illegal immigration also deters members of the public from visiting these areas, effectively nullifying their right to safe access. The effects of illegal immigration extend far beyond the southern border. In California, dangerous cartels grow illegal marijuana on federal forest lands and use the proceeds to fund gang wars, human trafficking, and other illicit activities. In New York, an overwhelming crush of migrants prompted the Biden administration to turn National Park Service land into an illegal immigrant tent city against the sustained outrage of local residents. Action is long overdue, and the Flash Act will tackle some of the most urgent issues facing federal borderlands. It will demand better coordination between federal land managers and Border Patrol agents to improve enforcement in remote areas. The legislation requires federal agencies to meaningfully address trash accumulations, marijuana cultivation, and other environmental hazards on our public landscapes. The bill also guarantees appalling abuses of national park lands, like what happened at Floyd Bennett Field, will never happen again. Finally, the Flash Act includes my legislation that would build new roads along the southern border to increase the operational effectiveness of Border Patrol operations. I first learned about the lack of accessible roads from Border Patrol agents on a tour in the Coronado National Forest, and it overwhelmingly remains the #1 security concern I hear about on our federal lands. Taken together, these statutory authorities will complement the work President Trump is doing to secure our border and keep our nation safer and more prosperous for generations to come. Again, I'm grateful for Representative Siscomani's leadership on the issue, and I especially appreciate all the witnesses who have traveled to be here. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Chairman Westerman. Now turn to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is a real crisis unfolding on our public lands that we really should be talking about today, but we're not. In just 2 months, President Trump and an unelected billionaire crony of his, Elon Musk, have upended every federal agency, recklessly laying off thousands of public servants, blocking critical funding for grants and critical projects, closing and attempting to sell key office buildings throughout the country, and the result is chaos and dysfunction across the government. The damage to our public lands is significant. Stop work orders are stalling or canceling wildfire mitigation projects. We may lose an entire season of wildfire preparation. Partner organizations are halting maintenance work that ensures safe public access to our public lands. Scientific research that informs how we manage habitat, how we adapt to climate change, which is a real thing, is being shelved. And now, we're just 3 days away from a federal government shutdown, and despite all of this, Republicans in this committee have shown no interest in actual, real oversight. They even refuse to question the so-called Department of Government Efficiency or any of its reckless, half-baked schemes that are coming out of this administration. And in fact, to make it worse, they're getting ready to vote on what they call a CR, is actually a partisan full-year funding bill, that surrenders all Article 1 authority to Donald Trump and Elon Musk, provides a rubber stamp for them to do even more of these reckless, destructive actions without any concern from our friends across the aisle. Meanwhile, the data continues to disappear from Mr. Musk's error-filled, quote, wall of receipts, which is really a wall of errors. Each new revelation exposes this initiative as arbitrary, haphazard, destructive, and from the other side, we hear deafening silence. The federal government is not a startup business. This is not a place to go fast and break things, and if you think that's a good idea, you're going to own the stuff that they break. When it fails, real people get hurt. And yet there is this strange infatuation with this Silicon Valley style experiment. They are breaking things, and anyone who is complicit in that owns the consequences. To be clear, Democrats do support rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse. We would love to work with you on bipartisan approaches to this. We welcome serious discussions on that front. That is not what's happening today. The Trump administration's goal is not efficiency, it's destruction. And the American people did not vote to destroy government or to crash the economy. As bad as it already is, it is about to get worse. They have signaled an intention just last week to add an additional 7,000 layoffs from the Forest Service. We can debate policy differences all day, but the reality is that these agencies can't function without staff. The writing is on the wall. Trump and Musk aren't trying to streamline government, they're trying to dismantle it, and they are hurting all of our constituents. Instead of convening a hearing on that, which is the real crisis facing public lands. We have a flashy messaging bill before us. This is obviously a misdirection. No one seriously believes the Flash Act will somehow safeguard our public lands. And to the extent they need safeguarding, the ranking member is exactly right. They can make one phone call to the Department of Interior and get everything that they would hope to achieve through this bill. This bill does nothing to address the real threats facing our land management agencies. It does nothing about chronic underfunding, about staffing shortages or forced attrition that are hollowing these agencies out. That's the real crisis. Our public lands are being turned into a sacrifice zone for Elon Musk and Donald Trump to cook up some cuts to provide billionaire tax cuts. So I could say a lot about the legislation before us, but the bottom line is this committee is not judiciary. This committee is not Homeland Security. We are torturing the jurisdictional limits of this committee so that we can have a conversation about Republicans' favorite subject. And because our jurisdiction is public lands right now, the greatest threats to our land isn't at the border. It's what we should be talking about, but we're not. Elon Musk and the White House doing all the damage they are with the chainsaw. I hope we can get back to some serious oversight. I hope we can stop torturing the jurisdiction of this subcommittee, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. We'll now move on to our first panel, which consists of the member who is sponsoring today's legislation. I now recognize Representative Siscomani for 5 minutes on HR 1820. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Tiffany, and thank you, Ranking Member Nagus, and the subcommittee members for coming together today for this important hearing on my legislation, HR 1820, the Federal Lands Amplified Security for Homeland Act, or FLASH Act for short. I first introduced this legislation following the field hearing this committee did in my district in Sierra Vista, Arizona last year. So thank you to the chairman for coming down for that and my Republican colleagues that made the trip with enough interest to see what was going on the ground. During this hearing, we heard from local stakeholders and ranchers about the border crisis that has impacted border communities and beyond during the Biden-Harris administration. I was proud to reintroduce it again this Congress as the problem still persists. So to my good friend, the ranking member, when the question is asked, why do this bill and not just a phone call? Because passing legislation and bills is our job, my friend. This is what we do. And we have to prevent any future administration like the Biden-Harris administration to be able to shelter in this disastrous situation once again. Now, not every constituent maybe out there is hearing or talking about this issue, but my constituents are telling me this every single day. And if you wonder why, you just got to look at that picture. If that wasn't anyone's backyard 24/7, you would be hearing from your constituents as well. So yes, I hear from my constituents on this almost on a daily basis, and I see it as well, as the vast majority of my district is a rural part of the district, much of it border, and that is what is seen there every single day. So this is important for this part of the country for sure, and for the entire nation, I would argue. So my bill would strengthen border security by providing for the construction of navigable roads along the border on federal lands, allows states to place temporary barriers on federal lands, and directs federal managers to develop a strategy to address hazardous trash piles which harm the environment. This is about the environment. Federal lands comprise an estimated 693 miles, or 35% of the southern border, many of which are in Arizona. This bill proposes comprehensive solutions for public safety issues and environmental destruction impacting federal lands along the border. In Tucson sector, much of which I represent, we saw over the past 4 years trash piles and camps popping up where smugglers had no regard, just like that one right there on the image, for the land or the environment. And this bill would solve that problem by requiring land managers to reduce the trash. Moreover, in areas where it is very hard for agents to navigate, this would allow our agents to have roads, even on federal lands. This is a game changer for many areas. Even when our CBP agents and officers are fully empowered to do their enforcement duties, as they are now, we must change our laws to ensure that burdensome regulations do not stand in the way of agents and public safety. Federal lands need to be protected from environmental degradation, and our borders need to be secured. Those go hand in hand. The fact is, we can do both, and I believe this bill is a huge step in that direction. I hope that we can have a conversation about how do we continue to protect our border and protect our environment all at once. Thank you for your consideration of this critical legislation. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields. I want to thank you for your testimony. We're going to go on to our second panel now. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for making the trip here to our nation's capital. I want to remind the witnesses that under committee rules, you must limit your oral statement to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, please press the on button on the microphone. We use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. At the end of 5 minutes, the light will turn red, and I will ask you to please complete your statement. First, I'd like to introduce the Honorable Thaddeus Cleveland, Sheriff of Terrell County, Texas. Sheriff Cleveland, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Tiffany, for having me today and other distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to come here and show support of our border and how federal lands and the U.S. border and border security intersect. Other than my time here in Washington, D.C., serving at U.S. Border Patrol headquarters and my time in the United States Air Force, I have lived a lifetime on the U.S.-Mexico border, both as a resident as well as a U.S. Border Patrol agent. I spent the last 11 years of my Border Patrol career in Terrell County, Sanderson, Texas, my hometown where I grew up and graduated high school, and where I would still be a Border Patrol agent, but unfortunately God had different plans. Our sheriff passed away, and I had the opportunity to take care of the community that took care of me and become the sheriff. When we talk about Terrell County, we're the 10th largest county in the state of Texas. We have 54 miles of river with Mexico, and it's about 2,300 square miles in total. Next to us is Brewster County, where we have the nation's 14th largest national park, Big Bend National Park. And through our portion of Texas, we have what's called the Wild and Scenic Rio Grande River that also is part of the National Park Service. The activity we have in Terrell County is very similar to what you've seen over the last 4 years under the President Biden administration, the increases that we've seen. We have nowhere near the amount of activity that you see on television with Eagle Pass, El Paso, Lukeville, Arizona, or San Diego, California, and we have a different type of activity. We don't have people coming to our portion of the border to surrender and seek some sort of political relief or political asylum. What we have are people that still want to cross the border illegally. They want to cross the border undetected. When we encounter them in the brush, they still run. When we encounter them on the highway, they lead us into high-speed pursuits that you see often televised. You may ask, why am I telling you a little bit about the activity we have in Terrell County? And it's because the portion I mentioned, the Wild and Scenic Rio Grande River. We have a location, we have several locations where people utilize the cross. One specifically that I like to talk about is called Paso, Colorado. And it's an area that only people crossing the border illegally get into this portion of the river. American citizens don't go into this portion of the river. It's very hard to get to. It's on private property. But this portion of the river is about 170 miles northwest of Eagle Pass, Texas. And we all recall Eagle Pass, Texas, talking about Governor Abbott's buoys that he deployed in the river that the administration said were harming the environment. Well, I can tell you, those buoys, I've been to them, I've touched them, and they are not harming the environment there in the Rio Grande River. Go back to the area I spoke of, Paso, Colorado, where illegal aliens cross in my county. I can show you what are called Salina mussels, as well as the Mexican fawnfoot mussel, and show you the remains of those that have died. And the only thing, again, that crosses that portion of the river or enters the river at that portion are people that are crossing our border illegally. Whether it's human waste, trash left behind, or even what they carry in what we call their mochilas, their backpacks, the chemicals, whether it's pain pills or it's salves for their feet, whatever they carry that's leaked into the river. That is what's having an impact on our environment in that area. I must also comment, I spent 10 years of my Border Patrol career out in Congressman Siscomani's district in Sierra Vista, and I spent some time over in Nogales, Arizona, which was my first duty station. And I can tell you firsthand, I've seen the amounts of trash, not only in my county, but that part of Arizona, the parts that the pictures there depicts. And I can tell you that there could be much more collaboration being done along the border between departments within the federal government. And when we talk about wildfires, when we talk about the necessity of roadways for Border Patrol to use, there's not a better way to create a fire break than if we do it in a proactive, mitigating manner, rather than waiting for a wildfire to break out, which I experienced in Nogales, Arizona, back in one of our deep canyons that is on part of the Coronado National Forest, where the fire broke out and Forest Service had to go in and just create these fire breaks. If we would go in and plan between Border Patrol, the Department of Interior, and have a way to mitigate crossings, but also work together on the deployment of technologies, I can tell you we would all benefit from it. In closing, I'd just like to say that, of course, what we saw in the last 4 years is unlike we've ever seen before. And our country will continue to pay for that for decades to come. And we will also pay for decades to come the abuses that happen on our federal lands, as well as our private landowners. They're just as important, equally as important. So I'd like to just, again, if we don't solve this, now we're going to pay for it for years to come, and I support the Flash Act. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff Cleveland. I now like to introduce Mr. Paul Perez, President of the National Border Patrol Council. Mr. Perez, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Tiffany, Ranking Member Neguse, members of the subcommittee, I want to thank you for adding me to testify this morning in support of Congressman Siscomani's Flash Act. My name is Paul Perez. I'm the president of the National Border Patrol Council. The council is the union that represents over 16,000 frontline Border Patrol agents protecting our country. After serving in the U.S. military, I joined the Border Patrol in 1997, and for the last 28 years, have been an active duty Border Patrol agent assigned to the Kingsville Station in the Rio Grande Valley sector, which is in South Texas. Border Patrol agents need 3 things to patrol our border: manpower, access, and situational awareness. Although the first on this list, manpower, is outside of your jurisdiction, I would like to spend a moment educating you on the challenges we are facing. We currently have 19,500 Border Patrol agents on duty to protect our border. Of this number, more than 2,500 are eligible to retire today. These agents could literally put in their retirement papers and be gone tomorrow. Another 4,000 agents will be eligible to retire in the next 4 years. In total, we are looking at nearly 1/3 of our manpower potentially leaving in the next 4 years. Why this matters is because under the last administration, we had approximately 2 million illegal aliens observed on Border Patrol surveillance platforms walk right into this country without being arrested. We saw them, but we literally did not have enough agents to arrest them. That is what happens when you do not have enough manpower to meet the mission. President Trump recognizes this challenge. He has proposed increasing Border Patrol agent pay and offering retention bonuses to keep the agents we already have. In addition, he has proposed recruitment bonuses to add an additional 10,000 agents above our current staffing level. I hope that you all will support these initiatives as they are brought forward in reconciliation and through the FY 2026 appropriations process. The second thing that you need to secure the border is access, and that is why the Flash Act is so important. Let me give you examples. When we detect drug cartel members or a group of illegal aliens crossing our border, we will dispatch agents to intercept them. Ideally, we'll have agents close by and in sufficient numbers to apprehend the group without incident. However, if it takes a long time to physically get agents on the scene, we have a problem. In some cases, we have agents in a foot chase, often at night across difficult terrain with a motivated adversary that has a 30 to 45-minute head start. To be candid, that is not the situation we want to be in. The longer it takes to get on scene, the higher the likelihood the cartel smugglers and illegal immigrants will evade capture. Where I am stationed in South Texas, much of the land north of the border is privately held. We have partnerships with local farmers and ranchers to access their land and, in some cases, install temporary surveillance assets that increase our situational awareness. I cannot tell you how important these partnerships are to securing our border. These farmers and ranchers don't just allow us to access their land, but they are another set of eyes and ears and will call us if they see anything suspicious. Approximately 1/3 of our border with Mexico abuts U.S. federal lands, nearly 600 miles. It's ironic that Border Patrol has, in some instances, better access to private land than we do with federal land held by the Departments of Interior and Agriculture. Our ability to access federal land now is largely at the discretion of individual federal land managers. To be clear, many of the federal land managers are terrific partners and support our mission. However, there are others who are more reticent to cooperate with Border Patrol. The Flash Act addresses this very issue and provides for the construction and maintenance of nearly 600 miles of roads across these federal lands. These roads will be all constructed within 10 miles of the border and will allow us the access we need to apprehend cartel smugglers and illegal immigrants. Finally, the third thing you need to patrol the border is situational awareness, and the Flash Act has the potential to increase that in two important ways. First, there are over 1 million acres of designated wild wilderness along our area. The Flash Act guarantees Border Patrol access to these areas and specifically allows us to install tactical infrastructure such as radio repeater towers and surveillance equipment. Second, it allows our border states to install temporary infrastructure on federal lands to support border security. In Texas, where I am stationed, Operation Lone Star has been wildly effective and dramatically drove down the rate of illegal immigration. I want to thank your committee again for their consideration of the Flash Act, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Perez. I'd now like to introduce Mr. Bob Krummenacher, a retired superintendent of Big Bend National Park. Mr. Krummenacher, you have 5 minutes. Did I say your name correctly?
You were very close. Krummenacher.
Krummenacher.
Thank you, sir.
You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Tiffany and distinguished members of this panel. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And Chairman Tiffany, it's good to see you again. You may recall when I testified before the Wisconsin legislature in favor of a bill you sponsored to amend the hunting regulations in the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore when I was the superintendent there. My name is Bob Krummenacher. I worked for the National Park Service for over 41 years as a biologist and a park superintendent in national parks all over the country. I retired in 2023 after almost 5 years as the superintendent of Big Bend National Park and the Rio Grande Wild and Scenic River. I'm here representing myself as well as the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks and the Association of National Park Rangers. These nonpartisan organizations have over 4,000 members. Coalition members collectively bring over 50,000 years of National Park Service management experience, and the association is committed to the protection of the national park system and to the persons who shoulder that responsibility. Big Bend National Park includes almost 800,000 acres of federally owned public land. The 118 miles of the Rio Grande that bound the park on the south comprise the longest contiguous stretch of land under one management authority along that border. While the United States owns no land or water in the Rio Grande Wild and Scenic River downstream of the national park, the Park Service has some management authority on the Wild and Scenic River for an additional 127 miles. I therefore had considerable stewardship responsibility for about 12.5% of the border, a total of 245 miles. During my tenure as the superintendent, I supervised law enforcement operations conducted by commissioned National Park Rangers, and while their authority did not include enforcement of immigration laws, we worked very closely with the U.S. Border Patrol, which had a base of operations in the park. NPS and Border Patrol staff at every level cooperated to protect multiple national interests at Big Bend: conservation, including the protection of wilderness character, public enjoyment, visitor and employee safety, and security of the nation's borders. These missions are not incompatible when there is a mutual respect for the other agencies' important role. Aside from their small substation, the Border Patrol has no other tactical infrastructure in Big Bend National Park. The deep canyons and flash floods of the Rio Grande and its tributaries make a physical border barrier infeasible, and most people in the area share that view regardless of where they stand on other issues. In my experience, the 2006 Memorandum of Understanding between Homeland Security, Agricultural, and Interior regarding cooperative national security on federal lands works and works well. The MOU specifies that it's not intended to prevent the Border Patrol from exercising emergency authorities to access lands, including motorized off-road pursuit of suspected cross-border violators. That said, the MOU clearly requires that the Border Patrol respect wilderness constraints except in cases of emergency, and even then they need to report back to the Land Management Agency what happened and why. The MOU also requires that the Land Management Agency respond expeditiously to the Border Patrol requests for infrastructure or operations that would normally be prohibited and not use wilderness as an excuse to automatically say no. Most importantly, the MOU directs the Border Patrol and the Land Management Agency work together at the lowest possible level to resolve differences. It further directs the agencies to respect and, to the degree possible, honor each other's mission. This worked at Big Bend. Park rangers and Border Patrol agents coordinated operations on an almost daily basis. We conducted shared training so we understood the other's mission, operations, and needs. We collaboratively resolved the issues that inevitably arose. And when we had conflicts, we did joint after-action reviews to learn from the experience and make sure we did better the next time. In my professional judgment, Title I of the Flash Act, while attempting to resolve legitimate border security challenges on federal lands, takes a blunt approach that is neither needed nor cost-effective. It has the potential to irreparably harm some of this nation's most spectacular and most loved landscapes. It would gut the protections of the Wilderness Act in federal borderlands, legislating a solution that simply isn't needed. Coupled with the drastic reductions being made to federal budgets and the staffing of the land management agencies, the bill's unspecified but undoubtedly high cost for construction and maintenance of high-standard border roads is both infeasible and inefficient. Thank you again for the invitation. I look forward to answering any questions members may have.
Thank you, Mr. Krummenacher. I'd now like to introduce Mr. Larry Lopez, a lieutenant at the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. Lieutenant Lopez, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Tiffany and members of the committee. I am Lieutenant Larry Lopez, and I'm honored to testify today on behalf of the San Bernardino County Sheriff Shannon Dykes in our department. We urgently need federal support to combat the illegal activities plaguing our federal lands. Activities that endanger public safety, devastate our environment, and violate human rights. I strongly support HR 1820, the Federal Lands Amplified Security for Homeland Act, Flash Act, which directly addresses the public safety crisis and environmental destruction caused by illegal operations on federal lands, particularly in San Bernardino County, home to some of the largest and most vulnerable federal lands in the country. This legislation provides critical enforcement tools, stronger penalties, and enhancement collaboration between federal and local agencies to dismantle organized criminal operations, prevent environmental destructions, and protect our communities. Sheriff Dykes is a member of the Major County Sheriffs of America, which represents sheriffs of the most populous counties in the United States from both political parties. The threat from illicit cannabis operations on public lands is one of the major drug-related threats that law enforcement, public health, and families are facing every day. To address these threats, MCSA has encouraged Congress to pass HALT Fentanyl Act to ensure law enforcement has investigative tools to deter fentanyl trafficking as much as possible. MCSA has also worked closely with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle to push for the reauthorization of the High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas Program at the National Drug Control Policy, ONDCP. HIDA provides resources that enable close collaboration among local, state, and federal law enforcement to combat the most significant drug trafficking organizations, including the cartels that are linked to cannabis operations in our public lands. I've been honored to serve in the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department for 25 years, with assignments including corrections and patrol in rural communities within the Morongo Basin and Joshua Tree area. In addition to patrol, I've served multiple ranks in specialized capacities, including our Specialized Enforcement Division, or SWAT, and our Gangs Narcotics Division. I'm proud to be the recipient of the San Bernardino County's Department Frank Bland Medal of Valor, the California Peace Officers Association Medal of Valor, the Governor's Public Safety Officers Medal of Valor, and the Congressional Badge of Bravery for my involvement in the Christopher Dorner manhunt in 2013. In 2022, I was promoted to the rank of lieutenant, and I'm currently assigned to the Gangs Narcotics Division. In this position, I oversee the daily operations of Inland Regional Narcotics Task Force, the Overdose Response Team, the Electronic Surveillance Unit, the Marijuana Enforcement Team, and the High-Tech Detail. Given my role in law enforcement and my knowledge with San Bernardino County's federal lands, I can speak to the unique challenge we face in enforcing the laws across such a vast and remote region. For context, the San Bernardino County is the largest county in the continental United States, with a landmass of over 20,000 square miles, larger than New Jersey, Connecticut, Delaware, and Rhode Island put together. San Bernardino County is a diverse geographical region with large valleys, mountainous terrain, and expansive desert regions. We're also home to two of the most populated national forests, the Angeles National Forest and the San Bernardino County National Forest. Approximately 80% of the land mass of San Bernardino County is made up of federal lands. The 2.2 million citizens we serve in 66 communities in collaboration with our municipal police departments. Our residents are primarily isolated and surrounded by federal lands in mountain regions and desert areas. This means that San Bernardino County is often impacted by law enforcement activities and federal mandated search and rescue activities that the Sheriff's Department responds to with the assistance of our fire districts. As it relates to the Flash Act, I want to bring up a significant issue associated with San Bernardino County's rural desert regions, which encompasses federal lands like the Mojave National Preserve, Joshua Tree National Park, and areas near the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center in 29 Palms. This base is currently home to one of the largest military training areas in the nation. The Mojave Viper program has become the pre-Operation Iraqi Freedom deployment training model at the base. The majority of the units in the Marine Corps deploying to Iraq were trained to Mojave Viper or mixed venue using the Mountain Warfare Training Center for Afghanistan. In recent years, we have seen an increase of illegal cannabis cultivation in these regions. The Flash Act includes provisions in Section 211 establishing robust response initiatives with local jurisdictions, law enforcement, and fire agencies to increase fines and penalties. Section 211 would also establish the Trespass Cannabis Cultivation Site Response Initiative, under which the Secretary concerned must conduct an environmental response on land under jurisdiction in response to illegal cultivation of cannabis.
Sir, could you wrap up your testimony, please?
Yes, sir. In conclusion, our challenges in San Bernardino County, particularly on our federal lands, are urgent and complex. Illegal cannabis cultivation driven by organized crime is wreaking havoc on our environment and our communities. These operations threaten public safety, fuel human trafficking, and introduce toxic chemicals into our ecosystem, putting both local wildlife and consumers across the nation at risk. While committing to addressing these issues, local law enforcement is stretched too thin and lack the legal authority to combat this problem entirely. The Flash Act offers a vital solution by providing more substantial penalties, federal resources, and better coordination between federal and local agencies. This legislation will empower us to dismantle these criminal enterprises and protect our national lands. I urge this committee to support the Flash Act and give law enforcement the tools we need to secure our borders, safeguard our environment, and restore our safety to our communities. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Lieutenant Lopez. And now we will take members' questions. I'm going to start out with my 5 minutes of questioning here. And first of all, though, I want to recount the visit a year ago that I made down to the Tucson region and south of Tucson, where we had the hearing in Sierra Vista. And as you can see, the picture to my right here, we found all kinds of trash, human waste. It's the reason, the genesis of the Trash Act that you see in this legislation that we're considering today. I find it amazing that we have allowed millions of pounds of trash to be spread across these areas like the Coronado National Forest. I believe Sheriff Cleveland, you commented about you perhaps worked in that sector. And I find it amazing that this was simply allowed to happen under the Biden administration. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle talk consistently about protecting the environment. And if there's as much as a cap full of oil that's spilled on a drilling site, there's an immediate reaction, yet we see this degradation that's going on some of our public lands, and not a peep was said because it stood in the way of the narrative of the Holy Grail, which was to import as many people illegally into this country as possible, even at the cost to our environment. I find it amazing. But I would point out one other thing on that trip. We happened to stop at a hotel that had been turned into a halfway house in Tucson by one of the NGOs that were profiting off from illegal immigration. One of the NGOs that was one of the vital links in the chain, as well as the cartels, the International Organization for Migration, other entities that made illegal immigration a big business on both sides of the border. We found in that Tucson hotel exactly what was happening in Arizona. And we exposed it to the world, and it was amazing how the footage that we shot at that hotel in Tucson went viral, showing how many people were profiting off from illegal immigration, including some who claimed to be doing it for charitable purposes. Hopefully, that day is gone now forever. To that point, are things changing? Sheriff Cleveland, we've seen a new administration since January 20th. Tell us, are things changing on the southern border?
100%. It's a night and day. It's been a complete 180. I've anticipated activity in our county to start picking up. I'm not sure that I mentioned, but again, the activity we have in our area pales in comparison to many parts of the U.S.-Mexico border. But between Del Rio, Texas to El Paso, Texas, we are the busiest county and the busiest Border Patrol station. And I anticipated, with the plus up of Department of Defense personnel on our side, as well as the Mexican National Guard on the south side, it would push activity to our area because we're a more rural area. But we have seen very few groups. We've seen the numbers, less than 300 apprehensions made across the southwest border. What it shows, I know I've said before in interviews, you know, a lot of times we say what a difference a year can make, but I'll tell you what a difference one person has made with President Trump's voice that has completely changed the dynamics on the southwest border.
So, yes or no, things have completely changed on the southern border since 2024?
Yes, completely changed.
Mr. Perez, has Border Patrol seen a change since January 20th?
100%, sir. Our posture has completely changed from a processing and facilitating workforce to a detecting and deterring workforce, where we're out there doing the job that we wanted to do by protecting the border, having all of our agents out on the line, forward deployed. Yes, sir.
Border Patrol currently has to respect legal restrictions associated, like with wilderness areas. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Do illegal immigrants also respect those rules and regulations that are supposed to be down on the southern border?
Not at all. They actually take advantage of it.
My final question I'm going to save for Lieutenant Lopez. So has legalization of marijuana made it less likely for the cartels to be growing marijuana in your state of California?
It's not less likely, it's more likely.
And are there, do you find a significant number of chemicals with marijuana grows? I think about it, it was happening in my state, in Wisconsin, northern Wisconsin, a number of years ago, and they found these very dangerous chemicals that were out in the environment. Do you find the same thing in California?
Yes, sir, we do.
With that, my 5 minutes are up, and I want to thank all of you for joining us. Next, I turn to Ms. Dexter for her questioning for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you all for coming today. As a physician and mother, I think every day about the world we are leaving behind for our children. And I sit here on this committee because I care deeply about public lands. We should be working together, as many of us have talked about today, to protect our public lands. I would argue it is not the place to be pushing a cruel and unnecessary immigration agenda that is minimally relevant to the work of this committee. Instead of addressing environmental challenges or actually staffing our parks and forests to keep them safe and clean, this administration is misusing funds and resources to fuel anti-immigration policies. Just look at Guantanamo Bay, where over 1,000 security forces and civilians are assigned to ongoing operations. This is a clear pattern. My Republican colleagues are diverting resources away from urgent priorities like delivering the services and benefits our veterans bled for, while putting them toward an agenda that puts our most vulnerable at risk and ignores civil rights and gives billionaires tax cuts. That's why I'm looking for answers. I'm demanding to know why Donald Trump is detaining immigrants with no criminal record in a maximum security prison. I'm demanding to know why Trump is refusing to give those detained due process. And I'm demanding to know why, in a committee that is tasked with protecting our public lands, this is the focus of today's hearing. To add insult to injury, we are holding this hearing while the Trump-Musk administration continues to fire thousands of workers at the Department of Interior, Forest Service, and National Parks. And will we hear from those agencies about what that is doing to their ability to carry out their missions? No, because my Republican colleagues have declined to invite them. It is my understanding that last Congress, the U.S. Forest Service testified before this committee that implementing the legislation before us today would require an upfront investment of $40 to $60 million, plus annual maintenance costs of up to $280,000. Mr. Krummenacher, with 1,000 job cuts at the National Park Service and 3,400 at the U.S. Forest Service, do these agencies have the capacity to implement a project of this scale? I'm sorry, let's just turn on your, thank you.
We do not have capacity. We are down staffing even before the Trump administration began.
Okay. And this bill before us today would also allow border states to place temporary movable structures, such as shipping containers, along the southern border without requiring a special use permit. We've already seen the devastating consequences of this approach. Between 2017 and 2021, Arizona stacked 922 shipping containers along 3.5 miles of the US-Mexico border in the Coronado National Forest, deep in the I'm gonna say it right, wrong, Huachuca Mountains. A GAO report later found that this project caused irreparable harm, damaged cultural sites, contaminated water sources, and endangered wildlife. Mr. Krummenacher, if this bill were to become law, how would the fragile habitats and ecosystems protected by our public lands be impacted?
I'll speak primarily to what I know of Big Bend National Park. The bigger concern that I have, frankly, in addition to the environmental issues that you just mentioned, is the fact that Big Bend National Park and many other old line national parks have exclusive federal jurisdiction. So right now, neither the state of Texas nor local law enforcement, both of whom we cooperate with very well, have the authority to actually enforce laws within the national park. And so I think this law would create huge ambiguity in terms of who's got the authority and the responsibility for that. In addition, placing barriers without any input from the National Park Service, there's no expertise in environmental issues, in wildlife, in watersheds, or in public use. And so Big Bend National Park, the border is part of the visitor experience. It's also a major factor for wildlife crossings. And so indiscriminate placement of infrastructure that may or may not be helpful to the border issue. And like Sheriff Cleveland said, we don't have that many immigrants that go across through there because of the terrain in Mexico, which is frankly unyielding. I think it would be mostly a show as opposed to something that would be effective, and it would do all sorts of harm to the national park and to the American people's experience in that national park.
Excellent. And I appreciate my colleague, Mr. Westerman's points and concerns about the protection of sensitive lands. Is it your opinion that cutting staff will help improve federal land protection and cleaning up of garbage and other things along our borders?
Trash is not merely an immigrant problem. It's a problem whenever there are people on the border. So Big Bend National Park and other public lands have trash challenges, and we don't have enough people. And so I know, at least within the area that I was responsible for, we didn't see large piles of immigrant trash. We had trouble collecting the trash that the visiting public generated, and Big Bend National Park had a landfill inside the national park, one of only two that does. So lowering the amount of trash is an excellent idea. I don't see how creating more penalties on those who already are violating the law by dropping trash in national parks, whether they're American citizens, visitors, or they're immigrants. I don't see how that will make a difference. Having enough people to actually collect the trash and to enforce the existing laws, that would make a huge difference.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I am shocked by the testimony we just heard. I've personally seen this enormous garbage patch that stretches across the southern border. The problem is illegal aliens don't only disobey our immigration laws, they also disobey our environmental laws with impunity. The piles of garbage that have been left behind are a major blight and a monument to the hypocrisy of the left. And to posture as a guardian of our federal lands and not recognize that is appalling to me. It leads me to believe if the Democratic witness has either not been there or just doesn't care. But that's the least of the damage of deliberately trafficking 8 million unvetted and impoverished illegal aliens into this country. The mass migration has overwhelmed our public schools, our public hospitals, our food pantries, our homeless shelters. They forced down wages for working American families. Supporting this impoverished population costs American taxpayers about $160 billion a year. Think of that as about $1,300 of your taxes as an average household every year. Worst of all, it's introduced into our cities the most violent criminal gangs and cartels on the planet, often shielded from deportation by the Democrat sanctuary laws, and yet it appears from what we just heard, the Democrats are still supporting these policies. One of the most appalling obstacles to enforcing our immigration laws has been the restrictions and the obstacles placed in the way of the Border Patrol by environmental regulations that hamper their operations along the border. Mr. Perez, has the environment on our federal borderlands improved over the last 4 years, now that 8 million illegal aliens were allowed to cross into our country and leave their garbage behind them?
Not at all, sir.
What have you observed?
Well, in a lot of these areas, these restrictions, they don't allow us free reign to patrol those areas. So the cartels take advantage of our inability to go in and patrol. We can only enter a lot of these under emergency situations, and because of that, we're not able to go out there and detect or deter.
I've made probably 10 trips to the border over the last 4 years, and the amount of garbage that is piled up is just appalling. Have you seen the same thing?
Yes, sir. Everywhere I've worked, I've seen the same thing.
And that's not American tourists. Those are illegal migrants who are not only thumbing their laws at our immigration laws, but also our environmental laws. So the Democratic policies have not only harmed the environment, let's talk about our immigration laws. Without enforcing those laws, we've got no immigration laws. Without immigration laws, we have no border, and without a border, we have no country. So, Mr. Perez, could you elaborate on the impediments that these environmental regulations have imposed on your agency's ability to enforce our immigration laws?
Yes, sir. Like I said, we're not able to get in and access all of this land. We're not able to put the tactical infrastructure such as portable radio repeaters, cameras, anything that allow us to better secure the border and detect anybody coming across. So the cartels, they take advantage of that. They're able to cross people, they're able to cross drugs, and they're also able to cross southbound money and weapons as well. So they don't follow the laws, they don't follow the regulations that our agents have to follow, so it is an impediment.
Sheriff Cleveland, the sheriff of Tulare County testified before the Immigration Subcommittee recently and estimated that about half of the crime that he's now dealing with in Tulare County, California, is generated by migrants, including the notorious Sinaloa cartel, which actually has assassination teams that go after the enemies of their gang. This comports with NYPD that was estimating that about 2/3 of the crime that they're dealing with in Manhattan is migrant-related, about I think half or so in Queens. What are you seeing in your county?
Well, as I mentioned, I retired as a Border Patrol agent in my county. I spent the last 11 years there. And I can tell you that I have arrested illegal aliens, not only as a Border Patrol agent, but as a sheriff that have criminal records. Do they all have criminal records? No, but many of them do.
Well, the Democrats, as the president pointed out, told us that, well, there's nothing they can do about that, is they deliberately trafficked 8 million illegal aliens into our country. I think the president was right. We didn't need new laws, we needed a new president. We got one, and we've seen a decrease of 95 to 97% of illegal border crossings, thank God. I'm out of time. Who do we have next? Ms. Leisure Fernandez.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, witnesses, for coming today. And I must say that I agree that we have a crisis on our public lands, but it's a crisis that President Trump and Elon Musk are causing through their actions to dismantle our federal land management agencies like the Forest Service, the National Park Service. You know, the Forest Service was already understaffed and underfunded before Trump and Musk, that unelected billionaire, fired 3,400 of their workers across the country. You know, USDA hasn't released the exact numbers, and I would note that there is no Trump administration official here, right? Nope, none at all. So we can ask them exact questions, right? The same way Republicans are refusing to do town halls because their voters will start asking them questions, we can ask the Trump administration these questions. But we think it's about 30% of the workers in the Santa Fe National Forest, where I represent, have been terminated. Representative Siscomani, who introduced the Flash Act, is not a stranger to these firings. His district is home to nearly 15,000 federal workers, and the Trump cuts are hurting the Coronado National Forest. In fact, Trump fired the only hydrologist in the whole forest. The only hydrologist in the whole forest. And for those of us who live in the Southwest and enjoy our mountains and our forests and know the problem with drought and the importance of water, to fire the only hydrologist is irresponsible. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record an article titled, "Fired U.S. Forest Service Worker at Coronado National Forest Speaks Out."
Without objection.
How can we expect agencies to manage our federal lands in the wake of these cuts alone, and then add more unfunded work to their plate as this bill would do? The bill we're considering today would add nearly 600 more miles of new roads for our federal land management agencies to maintain. And guess how much money it provides for the maintenance of those new roads? Nada, zero. So you're adding roads. Who's going to build those roads? How are you going to maintain those roads? Because there's no more new money. In fiscal year 2023, the National Park Service reported over $8 billion in deferred maintenance on its roads alone. Mr. Krummenacher, as a longtime leader in the National Park Service, how do you see the unfunded projects in this bill impacting the agency's ability to maintain its current services?
The Park Service can't maintain its current services now with the existing staff. And in fact, it's not just the recent cuts, which are estimated about 9% of the staff. Since 2010, Park Service is down about 16% in staff, and visitation has skyrocketed. So the ratios are going in exactly the wrong direction. So Big Bend National Park lost about 9 people, which is about 10% of its workforce since January 20th, and right now has no maintenance supervisors at all. So still has to deal with spring break and visitors, 500,000 visitors a year. And then you're looking at a deferred maintenance workload in Big Bend alone of $192 million. And so the park is falling behind now. And then to add additional roads, construction and maintenance in a desert environment where it's subject to flash floods and unstable soils, it just doesn't seem possible to me.
Right, and I think that, you know, we all agree that we need to address the fentanyl issues, right? But we also know that fentanyl is coming in the ports of entry, smuggled in by American citizens for the most part. So we need to invest in the technology and the places where we'll be able to capture that fentanyl and not put this undue burden in order to just make a big to-do when we're not actually funding the work that will solve the problem. And that's what I have with this bill, is it's not the solution that we need. And there's no money that goes along with it. And they're going to vote on a funding bill, the Republicans are, that gives Musk and Trump the ability to cut whatever they want. And I think that is a problem. Thank
Gentlelady's
you
time
very
has
much, Mr.
expired.
Chairman.
Mr. Fulcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, I just can't help but comment, and to my friends on the other side of the aisle, the Trump administration has been in place about 6 weeks. We've had an open border for 4 years. And so to try to hang this on the Trump administration or Elon Musk, that's beyond a stretch, Mr. Chairman. And I would think that would be obvious to most people, but apparently not. So I just need to add that to the record. I have a question for Mr. Perez, but I want to just point out there's a personal connection all over the country for this. And with the Flash Act, we're attempting to ensure Border Patrol has full access to federal lands. And even in my home state of Idaho, which is not a southern border state, we're actually a northern border state, but we have had the impacts of this substantially. We've got, in 2023 alone, 264 deaths related to fentanyl. And we've had 568 emergency department visits due to opioid overdose, and there were some deaths that occurred as a result of that too. So this is impacting all of us in a very significant way. And in your written testimony, Mr. Perez, you mentioned that you have greater access to privately held borderlands through partnerships, which is understandably frustrating. Could you just expand on that? And then what do you mean by that? And forgive some of us, by the way, because we got dueling committees, so if this is a repeat, forgive me for that. But please talk about that through these partnerships. And then also, have there been cases where these restrictions to federal land have led to known escapes or the inability to apprehend?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. So the partnerships that we've developed with ranchers that have privately owned land, they'll allow us to patrol their ranches. They benefit from it as well. They allow us to patrol the ranches, place infrastructure such as sensors, cameras. They allow us to go in and actually interdict groups of aliens that are coming across with smugglers, and also interrupt cartel activity. What we encounter on federal lands is we have to get permission to actually patrol. They will allow us in an emergency situation to get onto the land and go cross country if we have to, either with ATVs or vehicles, but that's only in an emergency situation. So what happens is the cartels take advantage of that fact, and they are able to operate in those areas without us being able to interdict them, because we don't have the ability to go on there without an emergency being
So
present.
if I understand correctly, there is at least a time delay. There might be an emergency access provision, but there's a time delay that could be harmful.
Absolutely. It does not allow us to effectively patrol those areas.
Mr. President, my friends on the other side of the aisle are arguing as well that the increasing Border Patrol access to federal lands could harm the environment. Now, I picked up on some of the conversations about the environment and environmental concerns, but what's your perspective on how we should prioritize this argument of environmental concerns over security?
Well, the priority should always be security. The amount of people that have been let into this country unvetted is a very scary notion for anybody in the country to understand that we had no way to vet the millions of people that we let in. And so there are, as you well know, there are criminals out there, there are gang members. The administration right now is doing everything they can to apprehend and remove them, but because we weren't allowed to do the job for the last 4 years, it's become a critical situation.
Thank you for that. Quick question for the sheriff. Sheriff, you mentioned in your testimony that the smugglers frequently change their tactics. Now, what we're trying to do with this flash is to increase access so that we can get access to federal lands. Do you anticipate, as a function of this, cartels shifting their routes deeper into private lands or possibly into more urban areas?
No, sir, I foresee them going to more of the remote areas. As a matter of fact, down in Big Bend National Park, what we spoke of just a few days ago, there was another group apprehended out in that way. We don't see a lot of activity in that specific area, but we do anticipate more activity in more of those rural areas versus those more urban-to-urban environments on both sides of the border.
Thank you for that. Thank you for your service collectively.
The
and,
gentleman yield?
Gentleman will
I
yield.
just wanted to point out regarding the staffing levels that in 2023, 34% of the National Park Service employees were still working from home.
I guess that substantiates my point, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Benz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here. Sheriff Cleveland, I'd like to talk about your space. I think you note that the size of your county is large. I'm familiar with large spaces. My district, I think, is the second largest congressional district in the United States that's not a full state. So I understand broad, huge, open space. I think mine is 72,000 square miles. I noticed that you have about, it says shares 54 miles of international border with Mexico, and then it takes care of about 91 miles. The bill suggests that we need a road or a barrier in even these remote areas. And when I was going through the materials, I noticed that your testimony mentions that 43 people have passed away out trying to cross those huge, wide open, empty, usually no water spaces. Am I getting the numbers correct? This is over the past 4 years, is that right?
Yes, so prior to the Biden administration, we'd have approximately one death in our county. Not very many, but over the last 4 years during the Biden administration, we actually had 43 people die trying to cross our portion of the U.S.-Mexico border.
The idea of having a road and a barrier would, at least we hope, start preventing some of those deaths. Is that your thought?
It definitely could. In Border Patrol, we utilize, we have a sensor package where if someone's in need, they can push a button to a rescue beacon, is what they're actually referred to receive help. Just due to the limited access in a lot of our area, we don't have very many of those deployed. I think we may have 3 or 4.
Part of the problem appears to be access. I think you mentioned that. So with a road, you could at least be down there and try to provide that kind of help. And the border's a lot longer than the miles that you patrol, and there's an awful lot of open, difficult terrain. What about the local private landowners? Are they supportive of a road or some sort of a barrier? What do the local ranchers think?
Most definitely. So our portion, talking about barriers, we don't need a barrier. In much of the Big Bend region, the Big Bend Border Patrol sector makes up 517 miles of the entire U.S.-Mexico border. That's 1/4 of it. What we have out there is what I call a God-made barrier. We have anywhere from 500 to 15 to 2,000-foot cliffs. The right deployment of technology and personnel is something that would benefit us. And then, of course, some of those access roads. And I was talking with Mr. Krummenacher earlier about our access roads, and to be honest with you, a lot of it is to give our landowners, something back, if you will, because we trespass on their land. Like Mr. Perez said, our relationships are superb with our landowners. They support us. They support the U.S. Border Patrol, and we're often trespassing on their lands, and there is a lack of access into some of those border areas.
This isn't a problem, I don't think, in Texas, but in California, the penalty for growing marijuana was dramatically reduced down to a misdemeanor. And thus, there's not much enthusiasm for apprehending folks that are growing marijuana because who cares, right? They're going to be probably turned loose. But this bill contains increased penalties, consequences actually, for cartel members that are growing marijuana. And thus, at least in states like California, there would be a penalty. You're a sheriff. You have to understand the value of having consequences when you go to the DA and say, hey, we apprehended. What do you think of that part of the bill?
And I'm smiling because it really coincides with the border security portion of it. If we don't have a consequence, which we didn't have over the last 4 years, people are going to continue to come. Same thing with the growing of marijuana, and I made the same analogy earlier. We used to catch tons of marijuana on the U.S.-Mexico border. When I first came in the Border Patrol in 1996, that was the primarily narcotic that we caught. We don't catch as much anymore because some of it just is being grown here in the United States because it has been legalized.
Yeah, well,
so if you don't have a consequence, yes.
Yes, we could talk for quite a while, sadly, about the negative impacts of legalization of hard drugs up in Oregon and the incredibly horrid consequences when it comes to fentanyl death and poisoning. And again, it's because the consequences of such practices were reduced down to basically nothing. Really appreciate your testimony, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Kennedy for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to have this hearing. I was just in Nogales, Arizona to witness the border for myself, and I will say there's been, as I'm a freshman and as an outsider, there was a lot of talk about we need to pass legislation to control the border. And in fact, there's order at the border now because we have the right president. We need legislation as well, and I do think, and I'll compliment Congressman Siscomani for this legislation. I think it's a step in the right direction for us, and I'm a big fan of passing legislation, but it takes a president with the will to control our border, and we actually do have a president with that will. When I went to the border this weekend and witnessed what was there was essentially nothing there. Nothing was happening. Now, there's always something happening, but and I was there for 48 hours, but it's impressive to see the order that has been brought, and I appreciate all of you for being here and being our witnesses to help us. I'll start with Sheriff Cleveland. Thanks for your testimony. And actually, I'll also point out to Mr. Lopez that I do want to, if you have any follow-up from your presentation, I understand you were cut short. So with my residual time that I hope to have, I'd like to turn that over to you. So if you'd prepare any comments you might have. But I'm a family practice doctor professionally, and I'm sensitive to the challenges that people can face when seeking medical care. And Mr. Cleveland, Sheriff Cleveland, in your testimony, you said Terrell County saw strains on the medical emergency resources as a result of the surge in border crossings. Has there been a rise in emergency room visits, and has it been to the detriment of your population? Can you tell me more about that?
Since the new administration came in, we've had very little activity, and we've had only one deceased legal alien we assisted with the neighboring county with, but we've had no emergency medical calls that I can recall since this new administration.
Congratulations. Previous to this new administration, what was that like for you?
Yeah, so again, we're a very large county. We're a very poor county, and there's not a lot of revenue coming in. So our sheriff's office, it's myself and 2 deputies. Fortunately, through Operation Lone Star, we've been able to hire an additional 2 in Operation Lone Star as Governor Abbott's response to the border. Like the sheriff's office, our emergency medical services only has 1 crew on at a time, which is made up of 2 people. So at times, if they're responding to border situations, it takes them out of service to respond to possibly situations that may be needed there in our county.
You told us there were how many deaths in the past?
The last 4 years, we had a total of 43 deaths.
43 deaths.
People trying to cross our portion of the border illegally.
Tragic. Everyone is tragic, but 43 of those is extremely tragic. But Mr. Lopez, if we can, did you have any further comments you'd like to make that you didn't get to make earlier?
I do thank you for your time to me. I'd like to point out that part of my testimony would include it's called carbofuran, which is a highly toxic chemical.
Used in the marijuana cultivation, right?
Correct. And I'd just like to point out how that affects my county going forward. So according to research from the LA Times, illegally smuggled carbofuran from Mexico to the U.S. is used on 90% of marijuana grows on public land in California. Illicit cannabis contaminated with carbofuran from California is a significant source of marijuana in states where it remains illegal. As this problem proliferated throughout our region, San Bernardino County, some of our northern counties in California, like Siskiyou and Humboldt County, also saw the same thing because there were virtually no consequences in California under Proposition 64. Recently, Los Angeles Times tested 25 cannabis products that were purchased from California legal retail stores and had them tested at private labs, which showed concentrations of pesticides above levels that the state allows or at levels that exceed federal standards for tobacco. The contaminants include chemicals tied to cancer, liver failure, thyroid disease, and genetic and neurological harm to users and unborn children. These harmful pesticides many of which originated from China, are being smuggled into the United States and used in illegal cannabis cultivation on public lands. Seized cannabis from illegal grows in San Bernardino County and Siskiyou counties has been traced to licensed facilities in Oregon and California, revealing a dangerous contamination risk. Many of these samples are coming back with these harmful pesticides that are originating on our public lands and inundating the legal market, created a public health situation where users of cannabis believe that their cannabis is legal and safe, but it is not safe. These pesticides have avoided detection by labs because the states like California do not require labs to test foreign labeled pesticides. After all, we shouldn't be using them. This poses a severe public health threat and contributes to the environment degradation. Thank you. I yield back the time.
Thank you very much, and I'll just conclude. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this opportunity, but we're allowing this carbofuran to toxify our citizens while we claim that floating barriers are creating a muscle concern at the border. And I'll just point out that we want to keep poisons out of our citizens' lives, and thank you for bringing up that testimony. I'll yield the remainder of my time, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Stauber, do you mind if I go to Representative Hageman next? Is that okay? I recognize Representative Hageman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for being here today. The Biden administration's open border policies have fueled a historic crisis of illegal immigration, drug trafficking, and environmental degradation along the U.S.-Mexico border, especially on federal lands. Roughly 35% of the southern border is comprised of federal land, which has been exploited by human traffickers, drug cartels, and illegal immigrants due to its remote and uncontrolled nature. Federal land management agencies have failed to provide Border Patrol with timely access and adequate infrastructure, allowing criminal activity to flourish and damaging public lands. HR 1820, the Flash Act, restores control by authorizing road construction, reducing environmental restrictions on border enforcement, increasing law enforcement access, and holding federal agencies accountable for securing our public lands. Our witness's testimony highlights the Flash Act's necessity to defend national security, preserve environmental resources, and empower local and federal law enforcement to combat illegal activity on our public lands. Sheriff Cleveland, Wyoming may be more than 1,000 miles from the southern border, but the consequences of failed border security have reached every single community. Fentanyl and other narcotics are flowing into Wyoming through illegal border crossings, and the cost to public safety and human life has been enormous. You have described the severe environmental damage in Terrell County caused by illegal crossings, including trash, human waste, erosion, and destroyed property. Have you seen evidence of long-term degradation of federal lands like national parks and wilderness areas in your region?
I would say yes, ma'am. And again, based on trash that's left behind, again, being a native of that area, having worked out in Arizona, in the Coronado National Forest, you know, a career in the U.S. Border Patrol and seeing the amounts of trash that's left behind. I also spoke to the buoys down in Eagle Pass and how the administration targeted our governor about the deployment of those. And then yet I can take you to a portion of my border in my county and show you where those mussels, although they aren't a human life, but where they're still, if we're making a point that those buoys are poisoning them or killing them, then I can show you where human crossing the border are definitely having an impact on those.
Okay. Wyoming is home to millions of acres of federal land, and we know firsthand how restrictive management practices can hinder law enforcement. How have road access limitations and federal permitting delays impacted Border Patrol's ability to secure terrain like in the Big Bend region?
So my county, there is no federal land other than on the wild and scenic Rio Grande River that we spoke of that's part of the national park system and the Big Bend National Park. All of our roads are personally owned, privately owned by landowners. In the Big Bend, I'm not aware of any problems. Again, great working relationship between the National Park Service, U.S. Border Patrol, and then our local law enforcement, speaking about Sheriff Dotson there, who we're both very familiar with. We do a great job, meaning all of us working together to protect our portion of the border out in that area.
Well, Mr. Perez, I'm going to turn to you then. Border Patrol's ability to access and patrol federal lands is not just a border issue, and it's in fact a national one. In Wyoming, 48% of our surface estate is owned by the federal government, and we know the challenges of dealing with land management agencies that prioritize paperwork over safety. You testified that Border Patrol has better access to private lands than to federal lands in some instances. Can you provide specific examples of how these access limitations have delayed apprehensions or prevented effective surveillance?
Yes, ma'am, thank you. So I can point out to deaths that occur because we're not able to patrol those lands unless there's an emergency, and we don't have the tactical infrastructure set up, so we can't monitor that area. So we've got essentially blind spots along the border, and the cartels take advantage of that because they don't adhere to the regulations we have to adhere to, and so it's very detrimental for us.
So under the Flash Act, the Department of the Interior and Agriculture would be required to install at least 584 miles of navigable roads within 10 miles of the border. From a national perspective, including in states like Wyoming, how would improving access infrastructure on public lands affect our ability to intercept drugs and human trafficking operations before they reach interior states?
This would essentially end what we call the no-go zones. We'd be able to actually go and patrol and have eyes along the border and take back the areas that we have ceded to the cartels because of the administration, the previous administration's policies.
Well, I think that that's all a very good thing for us to do. I appreciate your testimony. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize Representative Stauber to back cleanup here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Krummenacher, thanks for your service to the National Park. I want to just ask you this question. When, in your mind, did you feel the Park Service was fully staffed?
I don't think it's ever been fully staffed, sir, in my experience.
Okay. So it wasn't staffed under Bush properly, wasn't staffed under Obama, is that correct? Wasn't staffed under Trump 45, in your opinion, and it wasn't staffed properly under Biden. So as we move forward, I think that we have to look at making sure that, number one, the staffing is there, and number two, the parks remain open and accessible to all people, including those with disabilities. My wife and I are blessed with a child who is disabled. And so what we're seeing is we're working that angle. I think it's important that we keep that perspective. Mr. Perez, I have to tell you that I really appreciate what you do. I was in Yuma, Arizona, and then we went down to the Eagle Pass, Texas. I was speaking to some Border Patrol agents, and to my left was a young Border Patrol agent. I was talking about what they see as agents: dead bodies, murders, victims of rape, babies floating in the Rio Grande. And I saw this young agent just well up with tears. Well up with tears. When I was done, I went over and I shook her hand and thanked her for her service. And she says, "Thank you for mentioning that. What we have gone through these last 4 years, what you in law enforcement have seen, what the two other law enforcement professionals here today have seen. I'm sorry that you had to go through that. It's going to be different now. The border's going to be secure. You don't have to see babies floating in the Rio Grande. You don't have to see murder victims or rape victims or people who died along the way. I just want to say thank you for your service. I went down there more than the border czar did. It was devastating.
Thank you for that, sir.
I can't say it enough, and I will never forget that young agent crying because what she saw, and she knew that I knew. As a law enforcement officer myself, there's only a few of us in Congress that have ever worn the local uniform, and I'm one of them. I knew exactly what she was feeling. So with that being said, it's going to be different now. I do want to say that we have a northern border too, right? We have a northern border. When that influx was coming through the southwest border, you were bringing agents from the north to help, to give you some relief and help with the number of illegals that were crossing, which left our northern border wide open. 5,000% increase in crossings. The higher propensity of terrorists coming through our northern border. It's unconscionable. I'm part of the Grand Forks sector. I'm northern Minnesota. There's 600 miles. At times, there were 2 agents. Only 2 on that whole 600-mile stretch. Because of the Biden administration's policies, they were bringing everybody down or making them work during the day to in-process them via computer. People say, Pete, what keeps you up at night? Terrorism to our people and our food supply. We know, because of the Biden policies, this country now has to be on red alert because of what may happen. You all know, you as law enforcement officers, you know, you've seen it. I've been down there. You, as leading law enforcement professionals, your councilmen, your township supervisors, your county boards were begging us to shut down the border. They couldn't handle it. The schools, the hospitals, the social services couldn't handle it. The farmers couldn't handle it. One of the farmers lost hundreds of thousands of dollars of crops because when there's fecal matter or urine around a certain part, you have to remove the crop within a distance of that. Hundreds of thousands of dollars because of the policies of the Biden administration. It stops under this administration. In just 6 weeks, 97% reduction in illegal crossings. Mr. Perez and the others, thank you for your professional service. You have no idea how much we, as an American people, support you, and we will always defend you. God bless you all.
The gentleman yields and sums up the hearing quite well. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for their valuable testimony and members for your questions. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for witnesses, and we will ask that they respond to those in writing if you would respond to them. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the subcommittee must submit questions to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. on Friday, March 14, 2025. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for those responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the Subcommittee on Federal Lands stands adjourned.